This policy note, let me give you a bit of background. This is sponsored by Sustainable Energy and Economic Development Program, which is a UK government FCDO funded program. And we are working across a number of areas. It's a 37.5 million pound program, out of which about 15 million pound is for technical assistance to government of KP. And under the program, we are working across a broad range of interventions. But one area where we are working very closely with the government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is to create more fiscal space, which has become all the more important because in Pakistan, provinces traditionally have been relying more on federal transfers. And in the last few years, there has been this realization that provinces need to generate more own source revenue, more domestic resources, and sales tax on services is one of the most important and major heads. And Khyber Pakhtunkhwa has done wonders. And if you look at last year, there has been a 64% increase in the collection in sales tax on revenues on services. And that is despite the challenges posed by COVID-19. So government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is already doing a wonderful job. And we also think that other provinces have also done a great job. There's a great deal of learning that the province can benefit from. So with that thought in mind, we commissioned this research paper that was co-authored by Anjum Naseem Saab and Faisal Rasheed Saab, who jointly wrote this paper. And this paper is not an end in itself. This is supposed to lay the foundation for future reform work for government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And we are working very closely along with other FCDO funded programs with KPRA, with finance department, with the finance minister in pushing this reform agenda.
Sales tax on services, this is no secret that this is the most important provincial tax. The numbers speak for themselves. This tax contributes 56% of the provincial tax revenue in Pakistan. It's also a fact that in 2010-11, which here has been written as FY11 in short, the collection was being done by FPR on behalf of all the provinces. And at that time, provinces received a transfer of 66 billion rupees on account of sales expenses. So this was equivalent to about 0.36% of GDP. So by 17 and 18, this tax was contributing about 224 billion rupees, which was equivalent to 0.67% of GDP. So you can really see that in terms of tax to GDP ratio, this was doubling of revenue. There was a kind of a fragmentation of the value-added taxation system in Pakistan as a result of provincial tax collection. And that manifested itself in multiple tax rates that were imposed by the provincial governments. There were even sort of differences in the principles of taxation. So one province argues for the origin principle and the other argues for the destination principle of taxation. The objective of this policy note was to review the current system of sales tax on services in KPRA and other provinces, or the provincial revenue authorities, with primary focus on Punjab Revenue Authority. And we are aiming to identify lessons for improvements in KPRA. KPRA, I think Hassan also mentioned that it has made very good progress, and that is visible on this slide. So the number of taxpayers who are registered with KPRA has gone up from 323 when the authority was created to about 8,000. Similarly, in 2014, the collection was only 6 billion, which had increased to 17 billion in the last financial year, which was 2019 and 20. A lot of improvements in HR capacity have taken place, and I think visibly KPRA has started to use improvements in tax collection, and that is I think exemplified by the introduction of an SMS portal, decision support system, which helps the management of the field staff. And they have also come up with their own version of a restaurant invoice monitoring system, which going on, which has been implemented in some of the other provinces for a number of years. In terms of policy, one important area is that although provinces are taxing much bigger number of services right now compared to when it was being taxed by the FBR. However, there are still a large number of services which are outside the tax net. And by adding them, a lot of potential can be realized. And similarly, there are many services which are being undertaxed. So they are not really paying the kind of revenues that they should be paying. On the administrative side, why is this ineffective or a suboptimal situation? The problem is that IT is not being very effectively used. Their provinces are starting to use IT, but a lot needs to be done. Similarly, I think the general problem of taxation in Pakistan, that there is inadequate documentation, and then there are organizational weaknesses in the authority. I think these are kind of the major challenges being faced by the KPRA as well. So in terms of the areas of improvement that have been mentioned in the policy note, I think one important area is tax-based broadening. So many services, as I said, still outside the scope of tax, and provincial authorities are already thinking and trying to move towards a negative. So a negative list would mean that rather than adding new services to the scope of the tax every year, every service would be declared as taxable, and only the services which are declared as exempt, they would be exempt. All other services would be within the scope of the tax. And that would avoid a lot of hassle of bringing new services into the tax net through the Finance Act every year. And more importantly, I think that will help remove anomalies and interpretational disputes, which cause a lot of litigation in our taxation system. Because the service providers argue that the service that is taxable under a particular law, I'm not really providing that service. My category of service is slightly different, and that's why I am not subject to that tax. So all those disputes and litigation can be avoided if we move to a negative list of services. I think it's really important that we sort of see the contribution of all the services in the revenue collected by KPRA and the other provincial authorities. If there are services which are not being taxed properly, we can actually develop a plan, we can focus on them, improve their compliance, and increase revenue yield from these services. Organizational capacity of KPRA, I think this authority was created in the Directorate of Excise and Taxation, and it basically inherited the kind of organizational structure that was prevalent in the Directorate. And that basically meant that there was a concentration of different functions within a single position. So one officer was in charge of assessment, as enforcement and compliance, and sometimes audit as well. So I think that really is not the way a tax authority should be run. I think government has realized that, and they have therefore moved this authority into the finance department under the finance minister's own sort of surveillance, and that will help them actually organize this authority better. And it is recommended in the policy note that a thorough functional review of the authority should be undertaken. And in the light of that, the authority should be organized on functional lines. And that would mean that they would be able to sort of develop their own professional tax services, which would be focusing different specializations. Effective and efficient use of information technology could be very useful for KPRA. Because these days, IT is being used for tax-based broadening. Another objective is to establish a real-time connectivity with businesses, performance management of staff, dispute resolution through use of IT in a more sort of in a faster manner, improved interagency coordination, and tax compliance. And some of these examples are here highlighted in the boxes. I think the most exciting idea to me is the use of data scraping. So what is data scraping? This is basically use of IT to search to identify new taxpayers. Harmonization of sales taxation in Pakistan, and having a semblance of integration into our system is really, really important, because it is very difficult for businesses to operate in this situation. And for that, we have to sort of undertake to bring in political consensus, at least the provincial governments can have their own platform through which they can provide an opportunity to businesses to file a joint return that can help all the authorities. They can collect their own revenues, but the return would be only one. And that would also help settle their sort of input adjustment disputes as well. This note basically provides you some of the important lessons that can be used by KPRA. A logical step would be to develop a tax reform strategy through exploring further on some of these areas and setting up of a donor coordination forum, because as Hassan pointed out, there are a number of donors apart from FCDO like GIZ and some of the others, World Bank and USAID, who are also interested in supporting KPRA. So an action plan should be developed and responsibilities should be divided among the donors, and that would, I think, provide a lot of dividends to KPRA for future reforms.
The document is well crafted. The important aspect of capacity building, incorporating IT technologies, new ideas is some of the features of this report. I would just like to briefly explain what is happening in and around KP as a neutral person, because I joined from federal government, and what I observed was that the leadership, both political and administrative leadership within KP, are extremely pragmatic in a sense that they understand that this is a watershed moment for them. They've done enough hard work in the last 7 years in transforming their province, integrating it into a one unit, and bringing novelty within the overall framework. While working as within bureaucracy, novelty is not so encouraged, but now things are changing. New technologies are being embraced, new ideas are being embraced. I've seen that we have done mapping in shortest possible time. We are working into deregulation in shortest possible time. And Taimur Jhagra Sahab has been the champion of ease of doing business and bringing in tax reforms. What is so encouraging to see is KPRA is now working on building their capacity, and Taimur Sahab is actually managing the change management very well.
I welcome the report. I endorse the suggestions that it's made, and I'll tell you we've worked on some of them, would welcome help on areas like tax gap analysis, but there's other areas where we're already working. So for example, corporatizing the structure to make it more of a standalone organization. Over the last week, I looked at both the KPRA proposal for that and also studied the Sindh and Punjab, Sindh Revenue Board and Punjab Revenue Authority Acts to see what we can best do, and I hope to do that in this year. I can tell you that though this isn't the beginning of our reform journey, and my personal experience working in the private and development sectors, reforming KPRA and getting results out of it was one of the first things that I personally invested time in after assuming office in this government. And happy to say that over the last 2 years, revenue at KPRA essentially at least have doubled. Last year, we got about a 65% increase. Revenue went from just over 10 billion to north of 17 billion, so close to 70%. And this year, we are currently on a run rate to hit at least 20 billion, despite the COVID economic suppression. At the moment, we are actually on a greater run rate than that. There's a 60% increase. So we finish somewhere between 20 and 25 billion, depending on how the next 6 months pan out. And for a small province like KP, where there isn't been historically a tax-paying structure, I think that is important both from the consumer side as well as from the organization side, because I think one of the biggest things that we've done is actually invigorate the organization. They're actually going after the money that they need to collect in the right manner while trying to make life simpler for businesses, as opposed to just turning up to do a job and going back home. And I think that's a huge cultural shift. This year, we continue, and I can tell you that growth has come from three main sources. First, there's the dividend of the improved telco collection. Second, we have a number of smaller taxes. And third, they're also responsible for collecting an infrastructure development cess that wasn't properly collected previously, but that by doing a little bit of thinking, increasing the number of points that it's collected at, is going to show growth of about $1 billion over this year, from about 200 odd million or 300 odd million collected all of last year, to I believe about 1.2, 1.3 billion.